So I just got back to Little Rock about 2 months ago after a very long journey. I grew up here, and after college I moved out to California and worked as a solar engineer. And then about 6 years ago I quit my job. And from there forward my life was different, altered. So when I quit my job, all I knew was that I wanted to see the world, and I wanted to experience different ways that people were living in the world. So I decided to go to India to volunteer. So I didn't actually know where I was going to go or exactly what I was going to do, but when I got there I found a women's empowerment organization called EcoFem. And I started volunteering there, and that was for about 2 years. And somewhere in there I fell into depression. And I didn't know how to handle it. But I had heard about this reforestation project and sustainable living community called Sadhana Forest that was nearby. It was in the same town where I was already living. And they were taking volunteers, and they had a minimum volunteer period of 2 weeks. So I thought, okay, I'll try it out. So I moved there, and after about a week, I was totally happy again. Like depression, I didn't even know what that was anymore. And that experience really changed my life. I was living with a group of about 60 people from different countries. We were eating 3 meals a day together. We were planting trees. We were basically moving around dirt to build water catchment features so that to trap rainwater so that those trees could survive. And I ended up staying there for a year. When I came back to the States 3 years ago, I was really inspired to experience and see other models of intentional community and see what was possible for humanity. So now you guys are getting kind of a download of like 6 years tonight, and on Tuesday in part 2 of this presentation. But tonight I want to tell y'all about 3 intentional communities that I think are really awesome. So Twin Oaks Community is a 100-person income-sharing commune in rural Virginia. Kommune Niederkaufungen, which is German, and English for that is Kommune Niederkaufungen, is an 80-person income-sharing, debt-sharing, asset-sharing commune on the outskirts of Kassel, Germany. And Be the Change Project is not exactly an intentional community. It's a family homestead that kind of feels like an intentional community, and I'll talk more about that. And that's in Reno, Nevada. So you might be going, well, Anita, you haven't told us yet what an intentional community is. So bear with me here. This is the only slide I have that has words on it. I promise the rest is going to be photos and videos. But basically, an intentional community is just any group of people who choose to live together to achieve a common purpose. So it's a little bit different from a family because you don't get to choose your family. And also you might not have all the same mission or purpose as all of the members of your family. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't have both. A lot of people live in community with their spouse and children, and they get to have a really big family, which is a combination of blood family and chosen family. So what does that look like? An intentional community could look like a Christian community whose common purpose is prayer and service. It could look like a bunch of hippies living in the woods trying to grow their own food, and that's their common purpose. Or it could look like a group of friends in the city living in an apartment together and trying to create a supportive, nurturing environment for each other. So based on that definition, how many of y'all think you know someone who has lived in an intentional community? Okay, a lot of y'all. And how many of y'all think you visited or been to an intentional community? Okay, still a lot. And how many of y'all think that you've lived in an intentional community? Okay, a few. So that proves that intentional communities are not so strange. In fact, intentional communities are so not strange that people were living in these things at least as far back as 300 BC. Epicurus was a Greek philosopher. He started an intentional community with his friends, and they called it a garden. And the members of this community were called friends. And at one point, it's estimated that there were about 400,000 people living in these Epicurean gardens all around the Mediterranean. The only catch is that in order to join the community, as you can see in the statue, they would break your nose off. Just kidding! Epicurean gardens or communities were not cults. And all of the communities that I'm going to talk about today are definitely not cults. They're really great places. So, when I was in Europe this summer and I had just finished visiting a few communities, my German friend asked me, he said, "Anita, but why do you want to live in a community so badly?" And I froze. And I thought, nobody's ever asked me this question. And my first thought was, well, because I don't want to cook every day. And it's true. And then I thought about this question for a few more weeks, and I realized that I like living in community because it just feels natural. It feels good to come home and have people to talk to at the end of the day. It feels good to have children around, even if I don't have my own children. And it really feels good to not cook every day. I spent a total of about 2 months at Twin Oaks in 2013 and 2014, and I was really impressed. Twin Oaks started about 50 years ago, and the story of how they started is really interesting. Basically, a group of 8 friends was reading a book called Walden 2. And this book was about a fictional, utopian, experimental community called Walden 2. And this group of friends thought it would be a cool idea to start this community in real life. So someone agreed to lease them a bunch of land in rural Virginia for only $50 over 3 years. And if their group was still in existence at the end of those 3 years, they would have the option to buy the land. So they set out making hammocks, and they were able to support themselves and save enough money to buy the land. Eventually, they started a tofu business and an organic heirloom seed saving business. And now they're a community of about 90 adults and 15 children. So it's pretty impressive. Now, before we go thinking that starting a community is as easy as cutting up a bunch of clothes to weave some hammocks, I should tell y'all that there was a lot of thought and planning that went into this community. So Twin Oaks has a high level of structure. They have a few policy binders, 2 or 3 that are this thick, and that outline the way everything works in the community, the way membership works, the way their legal structure works, the way conflict resolution works. So they figured all this stuff out. They also have what they call a planner-manager system for decision making, which is a system of committees. And that was taken straight out of the book, Walden 2. And they also have a labor system, which is what I want to tell you all about. And that was also taken from the book. So the labor system works like this. As a member of the community, you work for 42 hours a week in exchange for getting all of your needs met. So those needs are, for example, food, a room to live in, health care, clothing, basically all of your basic needs. And then in addition to that, you get $75 per month as like a personal spending allowance. Now some of y'all are going, wait, 42 hours a week is more than I already work. So if you think about it, for those of us who work 40-hour work weeks, we come home from work at the end of the day, we make dinner, wash the dishes, clean the kitchen, maybe wash some laundry, take care of the kids, and before you know it, we've worked 70 or 80 hours a week. Now at Twin Oaks, those 42 hours include childcare, cooking, cleaning, all of those things that are traditionally feminized and devalued in our society. So it's actually a pretty good deal. And the best part is, that you don't have to cook every day, because usually someone's cooking for you. So my general impression of Twin Oaks is that it works really well. Actually, they've been around for about 50 years now, and they still continuously have a waiting list to get in. So it works, but the way that they've set up their labor system so that it's so structured and systematized, it allows for people to get isolated and disengaged from the community. For example, they make their decisions, at least their big decisions, using a system of clipboards. This is all the big decisions in the community right here, instead of face-to-face meetings. And so it would look like, for example, one of these clipboards is the annual budget. So it's got a few pages of their annual budget for all the businesses and all the needs of the community, like healthcare and all these things. And then they have a few blank pages behind the budget. And members can come and fill in their comments and requests for how to change it. But if you're one of those members who doesn't really care, then you never go to this clipboard. And they actually have a lot of people who just kind of disinvolve themselves from the decision-making process. Another reason they don't like to do meetings is because they find meetings to be incredibly inefficient. So how many of you have sat through like a 4-hour meeting before? Pretty much everyone. Maybe not the kids yet. So imagine if you had 100 people sitting in a meeting together trying to review the budget, and it took 4 hours to do that. That's 400 labor hours, which is equivalent to one person working for 10 days. So that work is all down the drain. So instead, they try to kind of streamline this process to take less of people's time. They also have a 3x5 board for announcements. So this is instead of face-to-face announcements. And this actually, I think, works a little bit better because most people check it. And announcements can be anything like, we had a baby calf born on the farm and its name is Helena. Or it could be, we're looking for a new person for the legal policy committee. Or it could be, hey, has anyone seen my red sweater? I don't know where I left it. So this is kind of their system that I do like. But again, it allows for people to just kind of disengage from the community. For example, when I was there, I made friends with this young woman, and I thought she was really cool and like really easy to get along with. And I was talking to her one day, and she said that there were 4 people in the community who were not on speaking terms with her. And then she would speak to them, but they wouldn't speak to her. And they actually have like a conflict resolution committee, and they make a pretty good effort, I think, in the community to resolve conflict. But sometimes the best that they can do to resolve conflict is just to agree not to speak to each other. And there are other people who were sitting around us basically said, oh yeah, I know a person who's not on speaking terms with me, which I thought was sort of interesting, which didn't really exist in any of the other communities. But I think it's partly because of the size of the community and because of the way that face-to-face contact is not required a lot of times, that people can get away with these like not being on speaking terms. So I think the biggest lesson that I learned from Twin Oaks is that organizational structure is very, very important for the longevity of the community. And you have to be very careful about what kind of culture is created by these organizational structures. Remember we talked about an intentional community has to have a common purpose, right? So at Twin Oaks, the common purpose is egalitarianism. And egalitarianism is just a big fancy word for equal sharing of resources, equal sharing of all resources. So that mainly means they share their money equally and they share the decision-making power equally, or at least people have equal access. Now, what Twin Oaks does not have in their common purpose is any like one set of values. So I'm going to read this because it's a little bit blurry. I took a photo of one of their zines, and Jonathan, who's a member of the community, makes a lot of really great comics. Members were asked, what's the one thing that can assure Sincerity will thrive as a unique community for another 25 years? So here, Sincerity is a fictional community, but actually these people look like Twin Oakers. So yeah, what's the one thing that can assure that they'll thrive? More computers. A total ban on computers. less reliance on animal agriculture, more meat, more traditional marriages, more gay men, more face-to-face meetings, no more dippy meetings. Replacing our cars with bikes and horses, replacing our old cars with newer cars. More personal space and money, less privatization of resources, more policies, less rules, more common ground, more diversity. Even though you can see by the photo there's not a lot of racial and ethnic diversity in the community, they have a lot of diversity of opinions and values and lifestyles. And I kind of like that because a lot of people stay at Twin Oaks for, some people stay for a few years, some people stay for 30-something years. And so I like that you're in a community that's not based on a strict value set. You can change your views on things over the years and you don't have to leave the community. And that's coming from someone like I have changed my views often in life. And so I feel like that's really important to value that flexibility. Yeah, so how does their economy work? So they share the income from their hammocks, tofu, and seeds businesses. But what about savings? What about assets and debts? Okay, so debt is kind of a thing in this country that's pretty bad. So can you join this community if you have debt? The answer is yes. And there are two ways to do it, and neither of which I think are particularly great. The first way is to do income-adjusted payment options, which means basically when you live at Twin Oaks, on paper you're making about $5,000 a year, and so you're considered too poor to be able to pay your loans. So you're basically just deferring your loans until you leave the community, if ever. So that option works. I think that's what most people do. And then some people are like, I'm just not going to pay my loans. And that also works as long as you're in the community and you don't need to have good credit. There's nothing about intentional communities intrinsically that doesn't allow for the sharing of debt. And we're going to talk about a debt sharing community next. In Germany, where the debt situation is not quite so bad. And there is also a debt sharing community that's starting in Washington, D.C. called Point A that is planning to share at least the minimum monthly debt payments. So that's how debt works. And then assets work like this. So if you have your own savings, you don't have to give it over to the community. You can keep it. But they ask that you kind of freeze it. Like there's nothing legal about it, but they ask basically that you don't use it, because then you would be living on a higher standard than everyone else in the community. So the idea is to create an even ground for everybody. And some of y'all asked about legal status. So most of the income sharing communities in the United States have a particular legal status called 501(d) nonprofit corporation. And this is a legal status that was created for the Shakers and for monasteries originally. And the only requirement is that, well, it's basically meant for religious organizations with a common treasury or a common bank account. But the IRS, fortunately, doesn't make you list your gods on the IRS form. So you don't really have to be a religious organization. You just have to be an organization that is holding all of your property in common and all of your money in common. So this is what most of them use. Basically, you don't get tax deductible donations, but you get lower taxes from having this status. So basically, Twin Oaks has got their stuff figured out. They've got a really great labor system. They've got a really figured out decision-making system. They've got tons of policy, and they're doing really well. But it's not for everyone, you know? The way of doing things there is doesn't appeal to everyone. But I think overall it's a pretty good quality of life. So I'm just going to show y'all a quick little video that was on television about Twin Oaks 6 years ago, just so you get a better picture of what it's like.
It's hard to believe, but 100 people live on this Virginia farm. Twin Oaks is above all tranquil.
A lot of people come here looking for utopia.
Russ McGee says it's not utopia, but he has no regrets about moving here nearly 7 years ago.
There's a certain commitment to simplicity here. You can't have a lot of travel or other cultural kind of entertainments in your life, but nonetheless there is a great richness and connectedness to this life.
There's a place I know where you and I can go.
There is entertainment here, but life is simple. Members post notices on billboards and clipboards instead of Facebook and Twitter. And because they live in buildings that house 10 to 20, there's less privacy. But Arthur, a recent member, says that's one of the things he likes about Twin Oaks.
And I worked out in the world for 25 years in a career and lived next to somebody for 4 years and never even knew who they were. Now I live with 90 people, I know them all. It's like living in a little village, an old European village for me.
A village where everything is free. Valerie has lived here for 17 years.
We get housing, we get health care, we get food, we get clothing, plus we get $75 a month for extras, the things the community doesn't provide.
New members don't have to donate their assets to the commune. What keeps the community going is work.
Basically, the agreement is you work your 42 hours and the community covers all of your costs.
Paxis Calta says members can choose their work, and there's lots of it.
Pretty much all of the aspects of daily life that we can get away with doing here we do. We fix our own cars, we build our own buildings, we educate our own kids.
Twin Oaks also makes hammocks and tofu. Members can satisfy their 42-hour work requirement at those enterprises. Income from those businesses provides Twin Oaks with cash to purchase consumer goods like automobiles. The community owns 17 cars. Like everything else here, they are shared. And that makes Twin Oaks more environmentally friendly than most American communities.
We consume 66% less electricity, 75% less gasoline, 88% less solid waste that goes to the landfill. It comes from this sharing thing.
It's a lifestyle that's essentially communist. But most of the members who leave the community become entrepreneurs.
Ready? Lift.
Member Keenan Dakota.
It's ironic that here we have this communal society, and what we do is we are training future capitalists.
Take me away, boys, my time is not long.
With the community at capacity, there's a waiting list to get into Twin Oaks. Susan Logue, VOA News, Louisa, Virginia.
Wrap me up in me oilskins and jumper. No more of the dark side.
Any questions or comments?
Do you have to know how to do all of the stuff they do already? Like, for example, like how to make hammocks and stuff like that? Or do they teach you that there?
They teach you everything. Yeah. And as a guest or a visitor there, you also get asked to work 42 hours a week, and they teach you also. Yeah.
Do they welcome any visitors?
They do. That's a really good question. Twin Oaks is one of the most visitor-friendly communities that I've ever been to, and they have an awesome visitor program. It's a 3-week program, and they like to accept visitors in structured ways. So they have weekend tours on Saturdays, but they do almost every month. They have a 3-week visitor period, and the visitor period is for A, people who are just interested in learning about Twin Oaks, and then B, people who are interested in applying for membership. So you don't have to apply for membership. And this 3 weeks is full of orientations about how every aspect of the community works, and they give you training in like how to make the hammocks and how to work in the tofu factory and all of that. And the best part of it is they have individuals who spend time with you, training you and teaching you about the community. And so like they've budgeted it that the ask contribution is $150 for the 3 weeks, but it's really sliding scale or just kind of like open to anything. So, and I highly, highly recommend their visitor program. Out of all the communities that I've been to, this is the best visitor experience. Yeah.
Do they have like in the sense of the workload that's shared amongst them, is it like 24 hours, or do they all have like an assimilated time where they all sleep and gather and work?
Everyone has their own schedule. So
Okay.
like the tofu factory has certain shifts, but the hammocks is, you can go work on hammocks at any time and fulfill your labor hours. The garden has certain shifts, but also it's really flexible. You can work outside of those shifts. And there's one member that I heard about that I never saw, but he was a total like night owl, and he would only work like in the middle of the night when no one was around. So I never saw him.
That's curious. It's got to be hard collectively to sleep in a place with like 10 different people where everyone's getting up and doing things at a different time of day.
Yeah, they have 465 acres.
Yeah.
And their kind of campus of like their buildings and work areas are spread out over several of those acres. So it's,
gotcha.
Yeah, it's pretty big.
What do children's like part in the community look like?
That's a good question. Children are not expected to work. They're not expected to do anything. But usually as they become teenagers, they start to plug in just a very little bit to the work. But the children are all like, they don't really have a school there. They kind of have like a kind of a homeschooling setup where there might be 2 or 3 people who kind of like help educate the children in addition to the parents, but it's not on a regular schedule because there's only 15 kids of varying ages. My general impression is that most of the kids homeschool up until like around middle school, and then most of them choose to go to public schools. And they can go to public schools in Charlottesville, mostly in Charlottesville, which is the nearest large town. Yeah.
So, outside of your job at the community, would you be able to have like anything supplemental or for money?
Yeah, that's one of the things that people with student debt do. Which I didn't mention. Once you've fulfilled your 42 hours a week, and it carries over from week to week, so you can work really hard for like a year and then kind of slack off for a year if you want to, but not most people don't do that. But yeah, you can work outside for supplemental income above the 42 hours a week that you can work in the community. I think there are some restrictions to that, and I don't know exactly what the details are. Okay, so now we're moving to Germany. I'd like to start with the question, what is a commune? Does anyone have any idea what a commune is?
Community?
It's a community, yeah. It's a type of intentional community where all of the property is held in common. So the more common model in the United States is that an intentional community will buy a bunch of land, form a land trust, and then sell off little pieces of the pie to different people so that they can build their own family homes or their own individual homes on those individual parcels. But a commune is a place where the land is owned in common, and usually the bank account is also in common. You're getting kind of a skewed presentation because these are the places that I really was interested in. But you'll also get some of the more individual finances kind of models. How Kommune Niederkaufungen started was about 30 years ago with a group of about 17 people. And these were all people who lived in the city of Hamburg, which is in northern Germany, and it's a really big city. And they all had this ideal that they wanted to have a Marxist economy. You might be familiar with the quote by Karl Marx, "From each according to ability, and to each according to need." So they were looking for land, and they wanted to start a community in the countryside. But the countryside is not so easy to find in Germany because it's a pretty densely populated country. And so they would find a piece of land, and then it would fall through, and half the group would drop out. And then they would find another piece of land, and then that would fall through, and then another half dropped out. But they kept, along the way, kept recruiting more people somehow. And by the time they found this building that they fixed up a bunch of them outside of Kassel, Germany, there were 17 people. And now they've grown to about 60 adults and 20 children. So this is not exactly in the countryside. It's in a dense village on the outskirts of Kassel, Germany, which is a medium-sized city. So they have about 4 acres there in this village, and it's 20 minutes by train and about 40 minutes by bicycle to the city. So they're kind of uniquely positioned to have agricultural land and to be able to have some room to spread out, but also they are like more accessible to the community, and their businesses therefore can be like more service-based. Basically, I was there this summer for about 3 weeks, also work exchanging, like working in exchange for room and board. And my general impression is that even though this whole Marxist economy thing sounds super idealistic and like it would never work, it works. and it's been working for them for 30 years. And so one of the lessons that I learned from them is that people have finite needs. So if I were to put one loaf of bread on that table back there, what do y'all think would happen? And say it was like really, really good German bread with lots of like sunflower seeds and it's like really sour and nice. What do you think would happen?
Someone would slice it up.
Yeah, someone would slice it up. And?
We would share it.
We would share it. Okay, y'all are great sharers. Okay, what could happen is that maybe there's not enough to go around, or maybe somebody in the room is like, oh, I want that bread, and they take like half of it. But what if I were to put out 100 loaves of that really nice bread on the back table? What do you think would happen? Yes.
I think it would be so much pieces of bread that they'll fall off the table.
There'll still be so many pieces of bread that they'll all fall off the table. I like that. So basically, all of us in the room, we probably couldn't eat all those 100 loaves of bread. And like, even if we all want or need that bread, our needs are finite. We can only eat so much, and we can only take so much home to our friends and family. This is kind of the way it works there. The typical German breakfast is slices of bread, really good bread, with like different spreads and butters and stuff like that on it. And so they make a lot of stuff on their own in the community, but they buy bread from a local bakery almost every morning. And this bread, they typically get like 20 loaves of bread, and you would think they would just all disappear. You don't really have to worry about things disappearing as long as there's enough to meet everyone's needs. The other lesson that I learned was that people can be trusted. So the way the Marxist economy works is basically there's a box of money. And this box of money is in the office, and all members have access to it. And anybody who's a member of the community can dip their fingers into this box of money, according to their need. All that's required is they write their name, how much money they took, and what they took it for. Now, if you take more than 150 euros, you are requested to announce it at the meeting. Say, I took 200 euros for this thing, and I'm just telling y'all. You don't have to ask permission. And when there is this level of trust, and also when people are trusted with such a high level of responsibility, they tend to not abuse that power. I think it's pretty inspiring. This picture I just put in there to prove to y'all that communes don't have to be dingy, disgusting, grungy places. Super clean and organized. This is their common room and dining hall. Yeah, so what's the common purpose of Niederkaufungen? Basically, their purpose is the Marxist economy, but it's more than just the way that they operate economically, it's the way of thinking. So instead of thinking in terms of an exchange economy, like Twin Oaks, for example, where you work 42 hours in exchange for getting your needs met, here you're contributing according to your ability and taking according to needs. So it's a shift in thinking to a needs-based economy. And this was like, when I heard about this place last year, I was like, oh my God, this has revolutionized like what I thought was possible. Also in their common purpose, unlike Twin Oaks, they're explicitly a left-wing, they have left-wing political beliefs. So they're explicitly anti-capitalist, feminist, environmentalist, and a bunch of other big words like that. So how does their economy work? This is a part of their kindergarten, which is one of their communal businesses. So they have a bunch of working cooperatives. And how they started their working cooperatives was that they tried to fulfill their own needs and expanded those businesses. So when they started having children, they thought, oh, we need to educate our children, let's start a kindergarten. And then they opened it up to the wider community. When they started having aging parents, they thought, oh, we need to take care of our parents, let's start an old people's daycare center. So they started that and opened it up to the larger community. So people come from that village and villages around, and even from the city of Kassel. This is part of the kindergarten as well. What else do they have? They have a fruit tree pruning service. They have a woodworking cooperative. They have a kitchen cooperative that cooks for the community. And at the same time, it also cooks for the kindergarten. So they separate out food for the kindergarten, and then they separate food with no salt and no spices for the old people's daycare. So they really like figured out how to combine all these businesses to meet their own needs and to meet the businesses' needs at the same time. They also have a CSA, a community supported agriculture farm, that they share between 4 communes in the area. So Kommune Niederkaufungen was kind of the original commune in this area, and then they inspired other communes to start. And now some of the working cooperatives are collaboratively owned by these different communes. So what I like about the kitchen cooperative thing is, well, I was there for 3 weeks. I was never asked to cook. I was actually asked to stay out of the kitchen because the kitchen cooperative had it covered. And so I was out harvesting fruit most of the time. And so it's great, you don't have to cook every day. My favorite part about community. So yeah, so they have these working cooperatives. A lot of us are familiar with worker-owned cooperatives. Basically, like all members of the cooperative are kind of like equal, they share the profit equally in the company. So at Niederkaufungen, each business is a separate entity, but at the end of the day, each business turns over all of its profits to the money box. Actually, to the bank account, and they always make sure there's cash in the money box from that bank account. So it's really like very high level of sharing that I didn't think was possible. So in addition to income sharing from these businesses, they also practice asset and debt sharing. So in Germany, the debt situation is different from here. I was asking them about debt sharing, and they were like, yeah, one time we had this guy join the community, and he was 6,000 euros in debt, which is about $6,000. And I thought, that's it? So they're able to practice debt sharing because there's not so much debt. And also, before they accept a member with debt, they have to look at their financial situation and on a case-by-case basis decide if they can accept that member. Okay, asset sharing. So they consider themselves to be one of the richest communes in Germany because they practice asset sharing. So that means that anyone who joins the community and has any savings instantly communalizes their savings, puts it in the pot. Most of the people who join the community don't have that much savings, but what also happens with assets is that when people have dying relatives, like aunts or uncles or grandparents, those inheritances go into the communal pot. Because let's face it, it's really not fair that some of us have like rich grandparents, that we don't even know, and some of us don't. So they've decided to communalize all of that, and I think that's why they have so much money to invest in building good business and have a pretty high standard of living because of that. So Ravi here is my friend who I was working in the garden with a lot, and he's the one on the right, and he liked to have a mid-morning coffee break, like every morning, and so he would make us stop working and bring us coffee and dark chocolate, and everything they have is like organic, fair trade, like of the highest quality. So one of the reasons they can afford this high quality stuff is because of the asset sharing. But the other reason they can afford it is because by living in a community and sharing your food, you're able to buy in bulk. And just by buying in bulk, you can switch from conventional to organic food and like not spend any more money. You could probably even save money. Yeah, so that's one benefit of living in community. So what happens in this kind of economy when you're all in? Like you put in all your savings or whatever you had, and you want to leave. So this commune is, people tend to join when they're older, like in their mid-30s, and they tend to stay for a long time. So there's not a ton of turnover. I think the average stay is 7 years, the minimum stay is 5 years, and a lot of people stay longer than that. So what happens when you want to leave? Well, there's a system for that. You make your own leaving contract. So before you join the community, before you can be even approved as a full member of the community, you make a leaving contract, and that is approved by consensus by everyone in the community. And so the leaving contract just says what you would need when you leave the community. Most people ask for a few thousand euros to start paying rent somewhere while they figure out work or whatever. and their bicycle. A few people need cars wherever they're going, so then they'll ask for a little bit extra. And as far as I know, it's never been debated because people are very reasonable in their leaving contracts. In addition to the leaving contract, it doesn't matter how old you are, even if you're in your 20s, they have a pension account, like a pension plan for every individual in the community. So basically, it's like you're accruing the equivalent of a 401k while you're living there, no matter how old you are. So one of the things that came up for me in this kind of economy where you just expect people to pitch in is like, I'm one of those people who horribly, like I tend to think, oh, like so-and-so is not pulling their weight. And I used to think this in the community in India that I've told you that I lived in. That, yeah, like people aren't always contributing enough. And so I interviewed people about this. And I asked 5 people how they felt about, if they felt that there were people in the community that they thought weren't contributing enough. And nearly all of them said, oh, maybe sometimes a little bit, but that's not really the problem. Actually, the problem is that I have this insecurity that maybe I'm not contributing enough. Isn't that crazy? So, I mean, that just goes to show that we are just as critical of others as we are of ourselves. Okay, so now we're going to watch a short video. It's really fun. It's about a boy named Jakob who lives in this community, and this video was done 3 years ago. I'm going to like pause and translate for y'all in between. And I don't know German, but I have my German friend, the same one who asked me why I like living in community. He translated this, and so I'm just going to relay the translation. So do we have a question back there? You can ask a question.
More of a statement.
Okay.
I go with the German class, and anyway, my German name is Jakob.
Really? Cool. How old are you?
9.
Cool. So this is you in 3 years.
Ich probier's mal alleine, ja?
Steht da drauf auf dem Zettel? Waschmittel bitte ins zweite oder größere Einfüllfach füllen.
Es sind nicht seine eigenen Klamotten, die Jakob hier wäscht. Jemand hat eine Waschanleitung dazugelegt. Jeder macht hier was für die Allgemeinheit. Das ist so in einer Kommune.
Jakob is not washing his own clothes. He's washing communal clothes, which could be partly his and partly some other people's clothes. And they have this system, you notice him reading a little piece of paper. They have this system where you put, you say, I want my clothes washed at 40 degrees. And they have these different tags that you can put, so you can say how many degrees Celsius you want your clothes washed at and what kind of cycle. And then you put that in your laundry basket, and then whoever comes along to wash clothes can like wash them for you or combine your load with someone else's. The narrator just said, these aren't Jakob's clothes, everyone's doing something for someone else in the commune. That's the way it works in a commune.
Und dann muss ich hier einfach nur noch auf Start drücken. Das ist von Jackie und so, glaube ich.
Ja, das kann sein. Das gucke ich mir immer nicht an, von wem das ist. Es sei denn, das ist von uns.
Eine Kommune ist eine große Gemeinschaft, in der mehrere Leute wohnen. Es können 7 Leute sein, es können aber auch 80 Leute sein, wie hier. Und diese Kommune ist so, dass sich alle aus der gleichen Kasse ihr Geld nehmen.
Like I said, a commune is a type of community where there could be 7 people or there could be 80 people. And everyone puts their money into the money box.
In der Kommune gibt es viele Wohnungen.
Ja.
Jakob wohnt in einer Wohngemeinschaft, zusammen mit 4 Erwachsenen und 4 Kindern. Das sind seine Schwester Charlotte und seine Eltern Andreas und Sanne.
Wer möchte, gibt auch Banane. Mein Vater, der betreut einfach die Fahrzeuge. Der verdient nicht wirklich Geld. Meine Mutter ist Pfarrerin. Die verdient da schon ordentlich Geld mit. Und das Geld, was die verdienen, hauptsächlich halt meine Mutter, das tun die in eine Kasse. Da tun einfach alle Kommunen ihr Geld rein und dann rausnehmen alle Kommunen ihr Geld.
Kommunarden nennen sich die erwachsenen Bewohner der Kommune.
There are several apartments in the commune, and in the apartment where Jakob lives, there are 4 adults and 4 children. His mom is a teacher, and his dad takes care of the cars. They both put their money in a communal cash box.
Und weil ihr Zusammenleben so besonders ist, wurde vor 6 Jahren schon ein Film über sie gedreht. Damals war Jakob 6.
Gott, war ich da klein. Ja, und da habe ich auch gedacht, Gott, waren da meine Eltern jung.
Living in the commune is so special that there was a television show made about me when I was 6 years old. And he says, gosh, I was so small.
Gut, dann machen wir so.
Heute ist Jakob 12. Gerade bereitet er sich auf eine Demonstration vor. In 2 Wochen will er auf die Straße gehen und entwirft dafür eine eigene Fahne.
Jakob is 12 years old now, and he's designing a flag for a demonstration against oil and nuclear power.
Wir können uns ja auch was Eigenes überlegen. Wir müssen ja nicht waagerechte Streifen machen, wir können ja auch senkrechte machen.
Ganz wie du willst.
Ich gehe ja hauptsächlich wegen dem Thema Atomkraft auf die Straße und auch für Frieden, weil also es wird ja um Öl gekämpft und für Öl werden Menschenleben aufs Spiel gesetzt und das kann ich überhaupt nicht nachvollziehen, weil Öl ist nicht wertvoller als ein Menschenleben.
He said, I don't understand why people are fighting for oil, because oil is not more valuable than human life.
Jetzt sucht Jakob noch Stoff für die Fahne. Sein Freund David kommt mit. Für alles Mögliche gibt es in der Kommune Lager, aus denen sich jeder etwas nehmen darf. Hier zum Beispiel die Kleiderkammer.
You'll notice now he's walking with David, who I'm not sure if this is his chosen parent, but how the parenting works is that each child, in addition to their own parents, they choose 1 or 2 adults to be part of their parenting group. So they were in the communal clothes closet looking for textiles for his flag.
David und Jakob sind im Lager für Nähzeug und Stoffe.
Ja, guck mal hier. Das sieht auch gut aus, oder?
Ja, dann nehmen wir das.
Schön stabil, glatt, dick und fest und groß.
Doch die Fahne muss erst mal warten. Denn heute hat Jakob sich mit seiner Familie zum Einkaufen verabredet.
And now he's saying that his flag has to wait because he has to go shopping with his parents.
Seine Eltern haben kein eigenes Konto. Wenn sie Geld brauchen, holen sie es sich aus dem Büro. Da steht die große Gemeinschaftskasse.
Also es gibt da halt eine Liste, wo man einträgt, wer bin ich, was nehme ich aus der Kasse und wofür.
Gut, okay, dann nehmen wir noch die 50 Euro raus. Hol mal alles raus und zähl es mal hier auf den Tisch. Und einstecken würde ich das, okay?
Davon wollen sie gleich neue Klamotten kaufen.
Na, ich gehe nicht gerne einkaufen.
He said when he was taking the money out of the money box with his parents there, He said, I'm writing down my name, how much I'm taking, and what for. And then he said at the end, I don't like shopping.
Do you know of any communities that follow this, like this Marxist ideology or in the United States right now?
That's a good question. So the question was, do you know any communities in the United States that are following the Marxist ideology? There's only 6 communes or communities in the United States that do income sharing.
So fall under the 501(b).
Yeah, most of them are 501(d), not all. But there's only 6 communities, and I use those terms interchangeably because all the income sharing communities are communes. But there's only 6 communities in the United States that share income. Why? There's so many more in Europe. And all of the US communities that do income sharing have more or less a structured way to do it. They don't have a money box where people have equal access to it. So the answer is no. But there's one commune that's forming in Washington, D.C. that is called the Point A project, and it's inspired by Kommune Niederkaufungen. Right now they have 6 members, and they're wanting to grow to maybe 20. They would like to set up a Marxist economy. Yeah.
I have 2 questions really quick. In regard to being kind of a share-all sort of community, Marxist, if you will, how far does that necessarily go with their belongings? Like, do they share clothes amongst one another?
Good question. Yeah, so each individual in the community in Niederkaufungen and also in Twin Oaks, each individual has their own room. So even if you're a married couple, each of you has your own room. Even if you're a child who's like 1 or 2 years old, you have your own room. And so that room is like yours. It's not legally yours, but it's really yours, and everything that's in that room is yours. So your clothes are yours, your toothbrush is yours, any personal belongings that you accrue there, even stuff that you take money out of the money box for and say, I need this thing for myself as an individual, those are your things.
And second question, I noticed that there was a clipboard in the background. Do they have a similar sense of like, you know, announcing things on that clipboard, and like how widely spread is that?
Yeah, good question. So they have weekly meetings to make all their decisions where everyone sits in a circle. So they don't do decisions by clipboard.
Okay.
When I was there wasn't really a clipboard that looked like that. So I don't know what that particular clipboard is for, but they have announcements on on like a huge bulletin board, and their decisions are all in meetings. Now I'm glad you brought that up because their decisions around money are interesting. So how do they regulate, for example, if people are just tending to take too much money out of the money box, how do they regulate that? So they have a budget review in each of their weekly meetings, and it's just a short part of the meeting. They say basically, oh, we're over budget or we're under budget by this much. And all the individuals are expected to regulate their spending accordingly. And it seems to work.
So if they're under budget, how do they all just like collectively put more into the pot?
Well then, yeah, if they're under budget, then the businesses
work a little harder,
and then people also just like spend less because they know that there's not as much to spend.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And I forgot to ask this with the first community, but what happens when somebody breaks the rules?
That's a good question. Usually social pressure kind of like keeps people from breaking rules, and if they do break rules, then if they break enough rules to like get kicked out of the community, then there's a process, like Twin Oaks has a process for everything. So they have a process for asking a member to leave. And as far as I know, in Twin Oaks' long history, it's been used very few times that the process of kicking someone out was initiated. And when that process was initiated, the person who was going to get kicked out decided to leave on their own because they probably figured, you know, like if I'm not wanted here, I'm just going to leave. Be the Change project is, like I said, it's not exactly an intentional community, but it's an urban homestead of this family of 4. Kyle, Katie, Wylan, and Liam. I'll let Katie tell you a little bit of their story in the video here in a minute, but basically they were teachers. They were disenfranchised with the whole education system and society. So they went to live off grid somewhere. And They did that for a while, and then they were kind of like dissatisfied with that. And they went to spend time at an intentional community in Missouri called the Possibility Alliance. And they were asked a question that forever changed their lives. So I really love this question. So I'm going to ask you all this question and give you a moment to reflect on it. If you could do anything in the world and be absolutely 100% guaranteed not to fail, what would it be? So Katie and Kyle, when they were asked this question, the answer was super clear. And they said, we have to go back to Reno and start a project. So they started an electricity-free, fossil fuel-free urban homestead. And they're living in what they call voluntary poverty. So they live with about $7,000 a year with their entire family of 4. They also do this recognizing their privilege, that they're white, well-educated, and come from well-educated families. I mentioned that they have a loose community around them, so they have friends who've moved into the neighborhood, including Josh and Candace's friends.
Yeah, our kids, some of their best buddies live there.
Oh, great.
Yeah, Delaney and Soren.
So, yeah, so there's about 4 households that are in the neighborhood that are kind of part of their community, and they share 3 meals per week together. So again, they don't cook every day. The different households have overlapping, but not exactly the same value sets and the same purpose. So it's not really unifying enough for them to like actually call themselves an intentional community. But Be the Change is the name of just Kyle and Katie's and their children's homestead. So basically my impression of this, or like why I wanted to talk to y'all about Be the Changes, because it's super, super, super inspiring. And I also spent a day there, 2 or 3 years ago, I spent a day there, and I kept in touch with them over the last few years because they're so awesome. So what is their purpose? What is their common purpose? So their purpose is pretty clear. It's what they call Gandhian nonviolence. So this term was pretty new to me when I went to visit them, and so they explained it to me. Gandhian nonviolence is like a wheel that has 3 different spokes to it. And these spokes are 1, self-reliance, 2, inner work, and 3, outer work. And all of these spokes should be in balance. So what Gandhi intended for self-reliance, the first spoke, to be was, so Gandhi was living in India in the 1940s when India was just on the verge of gaining independence from the British. And did any of y'all go to the talk last night about the Empire of Cotton? Okay, so they did a talk at the Clinton School about how much cotton was grown in Arkansas and how cotton has like such a representation of global capitalism and how it's like kind of the power has shifted to different countries over different centuries. So in the 1900s, in the early 1900s, India was one of the largest cotton producers in the world. But they were sending their cotton to the British at really cheap prices because the British had fixed those prices. And the British were doing all of the spinning and weaving of the cotton into textiles. So Gandhi said, hey, look guys, like if we want to have political independence from the British, we have to have economic independence. We have to have self-reliance. So Gandhi is often pictured in front of the spinning wheel, this wooden wheel, where they spin the cotton to yarns. So his version of self-reliance is to basically make the old system obsolete and to rely on ourselves to get our needs met. And kind of like what Katie and Kyle call withdrawing support from the bad systems so that we can support the systems that we want to see. So for Katie and Kyle, self-reliance means using wood for cooking and heating instead of fossil fuels. So withdrawing support from the fossil fuel industry, which is very destructive, and putting it into a renewable, self-reliant way of living. I mean, that's just one example. Also not using electricity. because of how destructive that is. The other two spokes are inner work and outer work. So inner work also can be interpreted, differently by different people. And for Katie, she told me a lot of it for her is gardening. Gardening is like meditation. It's like like a peaceful activity for her. She also meditates sometimes. And outer work is the giving back, the service work that they do in the community, which they do a lot of, which I'll tell you about in a minute. So Gandhi's whole theory was these things have to be all in balance. And for me, this was a big lesson and a big inspiration because I've always kind of felt that way, but I didn't really know how to put it into words. And for me, integral nonviolence just makes the whole picture more clear to me, and it really stuck with me. Okay, so this is their house. They actually raised money from friends and family and a few different nonprofits to buy this house. It was $40,000, and so now they own it outright. It's a half an acre, and it looks kind of ordinary from the front, but the front yard is some garden space, and the backyard is actually where they do a lot of their homesteading. So they have a lot of vegetables growing there. They have a couple of pigs, they have rabbits, and they have chickens for eggs. So how does their economy work? Kyle and Katie try to operate as much as possible on the gift economy. So they give things, they give free workshops and classes, and they give seedlings away, and they give vegetables away as much as they can, hoping that their needs will somehow get met by people. But it's kind of hard to live in the gift economy when not everyone around you is practicing the gift economy. So in order to survive, they work at a few nonprofits, like a few days a month, in order to make that $6,000 to $7,000 a year for the whole family. So they've really reduced their needs to very minimal so that they can spend most of their time doing community service. They recently started, actually Kyle recently started a worker collective called the Reno Rock Riders, and they're a bicycle composting service. But right now it's just getting started, and he's the only rider. They also, so their homestead doesn't have any kind of legal status. It's just called Be the Change Project. But they recently created a 501c3 nonprofit in order to be able to receive tax-deductible donations, and hopefully in the future to be able to leverage money to make affordable housing in their neighborhood. So I forgot to mention that this neighborhood is the most racially diverse neighborhood in Reno. There's white people, black people, a lot of Latino people, there's Samoan and Chinese people, at least as far as they know, these are what their neighbors, where the neighbors are coming from. So yeah, so this is Katie in the Giving Garden with a couple of kids who are in the after school program. They really do a lot to give back, and it really just continues to impress me. One of their biggest things that they do that they feel is really important to them is racial justice work. They feel that as white people, it's very important, and they feel that they have a responsibility to be involved in this. So I don't know if you all have heard of the book, The New Jim Crow, but they have a New Jim Crow study and action group. They exchange letters regularly with an inmate, and they're really into writing letters because of the no electricity thing. They both used to be teachers, and Katie's mom, who lives next door, used to be a university professor. And so all of them know how to give lectures, and so they all give lectures on mass incarceration around town. They hold a bunch of classes and workshops and after-school programs on gardening, natural building, different kinds of social issues. They've had over 1,000 people come through their homestead since they started. They have an edible hood program where they help all their neighbors as much as possible start their own gardens and find sources of manure and mulch. There's actually a horse stable in their neighborhood down the street, so they have a convenient source of fertilizer. It's so many things that I had to write them down. There's a lot of undocumented migrant workers from Latin American countries in Reno, and they've interviewed some of them and created a play. So instead of creating films, they create plays that allows them to use a lot of creativity. So they call their play Undocumented Voices. They're involved in rallies for a Guatemalan town that's being mined by Taupo Resources, which is a Reno-based company. So they're really into activism that's like on the local scale and relevant to their local community. They're on a climate action team for the city of Reno, and they're on their neighborhood advisory board. So these people are just like doing everything they can. Now I'm gonna let Katie just like tell you a little bit of their story.
How do we create a new way of being, a new culture here where just by living we do good. We don't have to like fight everything in the culture, because right now in order to really do good in the world is to really fight everything. My family and I started this project when we were teachers and found that we really, we loved working with the young people, but we found the system of teaching just so spiritually, physically, mentally, emotionally violent to both children and teachers and really to their families too. So we ultimately quit doing that and then ended up in a 200 square foot cabin at a friend's house. And so in moving into that, we had to you know, radically transform the amount of stuff that we had in our life, and it was really our first soiree into radical simplicity, and that that was a beautiful, such a freeing thing to just let go of almost everything we had. After being there for 2.5 years, we went to a number of really amazing places, 2 of which totally changed our lives. One of them was a natural building homestead and learning center called House Alive in Oregon. And then another was an amazing intentional community called the Possibility Alliance in Missouri. And so we lived at both of those places for about half a year each, and then after living in those places realized that they had given us the vision that we wanted, and we came back home to Reno, and that's when we started this project. And so this project is based on Gandhian integral nonviolence, which or at least our interpretation of that. Basically what that means is finding the roots of love in ourselves and nourishing those, and finding the roots of hate in ourselves and finding ways to weed those out and work slowly at weeding that. And that sounds really basic, but on a so it's a spiritual and like inner work practice, but it's also a daily life practice. And Gandhi was very adamant about that your daily life be your fullest expression of your religion, essentially, of what you believe is most important. And so we've created for the project a daily life that actively fosters roots of love. So I love gardening, I love being connected with plants and building with our hands and spending time with our children. All of those things, singing, talking, discussing and reading good books, and all of that, being in community with people, all of that fosters love in our lives. And so we spend a lot of time doing that. And then it also looks like withdrawing support from violent systems. That is part of the nurturing of hate that we all participate in our society. Really unconsciously and not meaning to hate other people, but essentially creating massive poverty, destruction, horrible, like essentially enslavement all around the world, so that we can do things like drive our cars, use computers, or what are the other thousands of things we do that create. So we don't use electricity because that's a one way that we withdraw support completely from, not only from the creation of electricity, which we all know to be a very environmentally devastating activity, but it also is a running away from consumerism in general. And the having lights on, it's a fascinating thing, but having lights on and the ability to use computers has a tremendous impact on how, like, an increased level of consumption.
Questions? What's making them sick? Do you know about their health care? Yeah, ask them about that, because that's a concern of mine in general. So they're on Medicaid because they are under the poverty line. And Katie actually had a knee surgery this last year, and so that was paid for through Medicaid.
That seems kind of interesting for I guess their whole concept, like, is to get away from the system and then to kind of then rely on the system in the background is kind of, I don't know, seems kind of weird to me.
Yeah, and I asked her about that because gift economy is this very, like, idealistic thing. And so I was like, oh, the Reno Rat Riders, that's a worker cooperative. That's not really gift economy. And she was like, yeah, gift economy is, like, what we're doing is messy and totally hypocritical and not, like, it's not easy. And so I think they're just trying to move as much as they can toward the change that they want to be, but also they're very grounded in reality.
I mean, I think in the balance of it all, they still try at least to give as much as they take, even if it's from a communal sense. Do they pay taxes, by the way?
No, they're what they call word tax resistors.
Yeah.
So just by making not enough money to be taxed, they don't pay tax.
I understand. Yeah, I got you.
I think you pointed out with Twin Oaks and the German community, some observations you made, that they really organized themselves carefully. In this last community, I didn't hear everything you had to say about it, but they're in the early stages, right? They haven't been around for very many years, so they're still kind of in the first draft of some of the things that they want to sort out over time.
Yeah, I think I forgot to mention that they started this 4 years ago, so it's very early on.
Do you know how long it takes for it to, like, get well organized and get out of this messy stage?
I don't know. My guess is something like 10 years.
I'd say it depends on the amount of people that are in the
I think it really just depends on a lot of things. The community that I lived at in India was about 10 years old. It was still really messy, but messy is in, like, structurally, logistically messy, but it felt like it was a mature project, after about 2 years. So if you think that living in community would be awesome, and you want to have a bigger family, and you don't want to cook every day, you should check out the Fellowship for Intentional Communities website. It's an international database of over 2,000 communities, and there's a community in almost every state in the US. And hey, if you don't find one you like, maybe you could start one. If you think that living in community and sharing income would be awesome, check out the Federation for Egalitarian Communities website. It's a group of 6 income sharing communities in the United States, including Twin Oaks. And they want to foster the intentional communities movement so bad that they share all of their documents publicly on their website. If you just want to hear more stories about communal living, you can check out my website, Eco-Nomada. And even if you don't want to live in community, I hope that listening to me talk has convinced you that the possibilities for humanity are endless. Thank you.